Hey guys, in this video we're going to have a very basic look at the number system that we use in mathematics. And this is the Hindu-Arabic number system in particular. And now you're probably not too familiar with some of the more advanced components in the number system, some of which you might not even be aware of. But we're going to break it down today and show you the different categories of numbers that we use and just explain the differences between the main categories so that you have a better understanding in general. So in our number system, which as I mentioned is the Hindu-Arabic number system that we use, all numbers can be broken down into two main categories: real numbers, and complex numbers. So let's start with complex numbers, which you probably haven't heard of before. These are numbers that can be represented in the form a plus bi, where a is the real component of these numbers and I is the imaginary component of these numbers. Now, if you're not familiar with imaginary numbers and they sound a bit confusing at this point, don't worry too much. They're not something that you need to touch on until fairly complex mathematics. It's something just more to be aware of at this stage. Now, imaginary numbers, although they sound, I guess, not particularly useful, do actually have some practical applications. So in mathematics, electronics, there are uses for them where the meaning behind them and the point of them will become more relevant. But we won't touch upon that in this video or too soon in the future. So just something more to keep in mind. So all other numbers we refer to as real numbers, and those are numbers that have no imaginary component. Technically, real numbers are complex as well. It's just that the imaginary component is non-existent in those. So they'll just have an A component, they won't have an I component. And you can, of course, combine real and complex numbers in mathematics. They're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to only use complex numbers without real. You can use them together. But like I say, we won't go into that in this video. So next, real numbers can be broken down into two more categories. You've got rational numbers, and then you've got, you guessed it, irrational numbers. So these you might be a little bit more familiar with. Rational numbers are numbers that we can represent in a fraction in the form a over b. And what do I mean by this? I mean we can put real numbers into the numerator and the denominator of a fraction that will accurately represent these numbers. And this includes a few different types of numbers, such as integers. Integers are just whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc. No room for fractions or decimals. They're numbers that can be expressed where a divided by b will give you a whole number. Then, of course, we've got fractions, which you should be familiar with. And lastly, decimals, which decimals and fractions are just different ways of representing the same number, but something you should be familiar with. Then we've got irrational numbers, and as you can probably guess, irrational numbers cannot be represented in the form a over b. And what do I mean by this? I mean that there's no number you can put in the numerator and denominator that accurately represents this number, the irrational number. Now, this might seem like a bit of a foreign concept at this stage, but the more you study mathematics, you'll quickly realize that it's actually fairly common. There are a lot of irrational numbers. A few examples of these are things like surds. So surds are when we represent a number such as square root 2, or we find the root of a number such as 2. Sometimes, let's say for example, the square root of 4, this does come out as an integer or as a rational number, but in the case of the square root of 2, there's no rational number that this can be reduced to. this ends up resulting in a decimal that is never ending. So, for example, root 2 ends up coming out as 1.4142, etc. There's no quick way, or no way at all to write this number root 2 out as a decimal or a fraction. It's a never-ending sequence. So that's a good way to think of an irrational number. And there's a couple of other examples. Pi, you may have heard of this. Don't worry too much if you haven't. We'll cover over this in another video. And likewise with another irrational number, e, which is fairly commonly used in maths as well. So that's the basic building blocks of our number system. You've got real numbers and complex numbers, and then real numbers broken down into rational and irrational numbers. That's the most important thing to be aware of at this stage. Just know that there's different types of numbers, and know that we cannot represent an irrational number in this form, and know that all rational numbers can be represented as a over b. Fractions and decimals you can move a number between one and the other. Because they are rational, there's a way to represent them in both ways. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the moment. Thanks for watching, guys. Leave any questions in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed, and have a good one. Bye.